Was there ever a night when there was a thunderstorm and it was keeping you awake and you were afraid that a lightning bolt was going to come through the roof and zap you right there in your bed? Did you hide under the covers? Did you think that the covers, that your blankets would protect you from the lightning? Now when we think about that as adults, we think, well, that's pretty silly. We know that a blanket can't stop a lightning bolt. But I would like to propose that it's not quite as silly as you may think it was. That in a way, that sense of security that you felt when you were under the covers, that there's something rooted in that's spiritual. And I don't think that as a kid you were being quite as silly as you think now as a logical adult looking back. So I want to try to convince you of that this evening, and I want you to go back to your childhood when you felt that comfort and reassurance and that relief from terror just because you were under your covers. So that protection, that covering, is going to begin tonight with the instructions and the concepts of the Moedim, concepts that we've been pulling out all these concepts and themes as we've been going through all of our sets of 7. And these are things that we've started to notice and stack on top of each other because of our study of creation and all those things that we have become familiar with. So to pick up from last time where we were, I ended by saying that the Moedim were from eternity, and that we saw that in the word for Moedim, that Moed, the M being the mem being the from, and then the other part of the word meaning eternity. So this week we are going to look at the spring Moedim. In particular, we're going to pick on those a little bit, and how those appointments in time, passed from beyond time, passed from eternity, that they help to inform and prepare us for something, for God's plan of redemption, protection, and for restoration. So this idea of being beyond time or outside of time as we know it, a little bit later tonight, after we talk about some of pull out some of the details having to do with those spring feasts, I'm going to propose something based on that idea of being outside of time, of entering into eternity, into the kingdom, into the garden, and that being kind of a picture of his people being sheltered in a hidden secret place, kind of like under the covers. So let's cover just some logistical stuff with these, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the timing and some of the things that are done during these spring feasts. This tonight is not going to be a how-to guide on them. I'm pulling out specific things because I know that I tend to do like information overload and try to stick too much in there. And I would try to pull out as much as possible that was extraneous. And this was not a session to sit here and teach you how to observe the feast. You can figure that out on your own. So the first thing that I wanted to point out in regards to all 7 of these, and I have all 7 of them listed here, is that there are 3 times a year. These are the 7 that occur during the year, and there are 3 times a year when you appear before the Lord in the place where he chooses. This is at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which I put a red box around all 3 of those first ones: Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, because collectively they're referred to as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I think you'll see why those are lumped together like that. And then at at Shavuot, the one in the middle, and then again at Sukkot. You're going to hear terms like the pilgrimage festivals or the foot festivals. It means this is when it says all your males shall appear before the Lord your God. This is like a representative from each family goes up to the place he chooses, which is Jerusalem. So you would see representatives from all the families going up to Jerusalem 3 times a year, and these are the 3. In your workbook, if you're following along in the Creation Gospel Workbook, you're going to see that she lumps these into bundles. That she puts the spring ones in a bundle. Shavuot, the one in the middle, is all by itself, and then the fall feasts are in a bundle together. And I think you'll see why those are arranged in those 3 bundles. You already see that those are 3 times a year when you go up. Also, keep in mind that we're talking about an agricultural society. And so those 3 bundles, those 3 sections are geared around the harvests. You have the barley harvest in the spring, the wheat harvest in the summerish in between, and then you have the fruit harvest in the fall. And keep in mind with fruit harvest, some key language that if you come across grapes and olives in the Bible, it might be an allusion to Sukkot, that festival of ingathering, when they bring in everything else at the end of the season. So when you see grapes, think wine. And when you see olives, think oil. We are going to start with tonight with the spring bundle, this hamburger looking thing over to the right. Is it on your right? I'm terrible with left and right. On your right. And this is a 8-day period. The bundle in the fall is a 21-day period. So this one is much more condensed in terms of time. And you've got the way that works, and I'll just explain this to you to the extent that you understand why they're bundled together and why that whole chunk is called unleavened bread. You've got the Passover that happens on the 14th of the first month, and then the very next day starts the second one, the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And that's going to be 7 days. And there's your 8 days. And you say, well, where's first fruits? First fruits is going to occur during that week of unleavened bread. So you see how these are kind of layered on top of each other. Passover is the starting point, and then you've got that week of unleavened bread, and during that week, you're going to have the first fruits. When they're given instructions for the Passover, there's a real detailed instructions for the first Passover, and then for subsequent Passovers, it's not quite as detailed. But on the first one, they were to slaughter the lamb at twilight on the 14th, put the blood on the doorposts. We're talking about just the first one now, just the first of those. We're talking about Passover. Put the blood on the doorposts, roast the lamb whole with fire, eat it all that night, none left over. Anything that was left over was burned, and you were to eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Now, he says you shall eat it in this way, with your garment belted around your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in a hurry. In subsequent Passovers, he's going to say, you do the sacrifice in the place which I choose, which is Jerusalem, that you are to eat it with unleavened bread, so that you remember coming out of Egypt. And here's a set of those instructions for subsequent Passovers, a little section of it. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in a hurry. Now, we've seen that term in a hurry twice now in reference to the Passover, and that's going to become important later. I want you to remember that for later, in a hurry, or your translation might say in haste. So, To review, the Passover happens on the 14th, that first one. The next day starts the week of unleavened bread for 7 days, and during that 7 days, you will have the first fruits of the barley. And that day is going to move around a little bit within that week of unleavened bread. It's supposed to be on the day after the Sabbath during that week, because in a period of 7 days, you're going to have a weekly Sabbath. So the day after that, and that all depends on whether it starts on a first day, second day, third day, that's going to move around. Now, this third one, I want to pull out not everything you do, or not all the instructions that are given to them about the first fruits of the barley, but some specific things that I want you to keep in mind. On that day, we're talking about the third one now, first fruits, you are to bring a sheaf of the first fruits to the priest, and that sheaf is to be waved before the Lord. And in Leviticus, he says you cannot eat of any bread or roasted new grain until the day you have brought that offering to God. So we're talking about the first crop of the year, the barley crop. And he's saying you cannot eat of the produce of the land until you bring that first fruits sheaf and have the priest wave it before the Lord. Now, that day also starts the counting of the Omer. So whenever that third day occurs during that week of unleavened bread, you would start your count up to 50 days, and that's when your middle one there, Shavuot, is going to happen. It's also called the Feast of Weeks, because what happens on that first fruits day, from that day you're going to count 7 weeks, and then the day after that will be Shavuot. That's how you end up with 50 days. 7 weeks times 7 days in a week is 49, and then the day after is the 50th day. So that count starts there on first fruits. So there's this link there in terms of timing. Now, that Shavuot out there, though, being that far away, that's a bundle by itself. So these final 3 Moedim over here on the other side, those are going to occur during the 7th month. They're quite a distance from the middle one. That's going to be in the fall. So we are going to, with that in mind, with those details about it in mind, we're going to look at the patterns and the spiritual significance about that first bundle there, the Passover of unleavened bread and first fruits. We're going to look at those as pictures or a pattern of redemption from death and then resurrection. And we'll begin first with Passover. We'll back up to the days of creation to pick up some of the language and themes that we learned back there to help establish this pattern. Passover and day 1. On day 1 of creation, God spoke the words, "Let there be light," and light was. It responded in obedience, and light was called good. And then light was separated from the darkness. And when we did that, we talked about that term darkness, the koshek, and that it's defined as a secret place or to be hidden. Darkness is often representative of evil, but not all the time. When the term darkness is used, remember it's what can't be seen. You might want to think obscure, hidden, or secret. And then based on the context, you figure out if that is going to represent a bad thing there. Now, in Egypt, there was some darkness. That 9th plague in Egypt was darkness. It was thick darkness that could be felt. They couldn't see one another. And it says, no one rose from his place for 3 days. That's resurrection language right there. But the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. Now, that period of darkness is followed by the final plague, the death of the firstborn. And that's where Israel receives their instructions for the Passover, that first of the 7 Moedim there. So back on day 1, you had God speak. Light obeys. It's separated from darkness. And now God speaks his instructions for the Passover to Israel. The people obey. Their firstborn are spared, and the people are separated out of Egypt. And when they when they come out of Egypt, their very first place that they stop and camp is named Sukkot. They have gone from the Passover here straight to Sukkot here, from the first to the last, so to speak. A camping place named Sukkot, and I think that there's some significance there. Now, here at Sukkot, God gives them the instructions. Does anybody know what happened at Sukkot? Do you remember what happened there? This is before they get to the Red Sea. Yeah, let's look at it. Does anyone remember what happened at Sukkot?
Talking about the first Sukkot when they left Egypt?
The very first Sukkot. Yeah, before they get to the Red Sea, for their...
Wasn't there a test about water that was drinkable or something there?
Not quite yet. We haven't crossed over the Red Sea yet. Pharaoh has not been destroyed yet. This is their very first place they stop. What they received there are the instructions for the redemption of the firstborn. So Passover, the death of the firstborn, and then they go and camp at Sukkot, where they've received the instructions for the redemption of the firstborn. So you have these bookends here. Now, when they leave, they are led into the wilderness under a cloud. And as they arrive at the Red Sea, that cloud moves from being in front of them to being behind them. It moves between them, the camp of Israel, and the camp of Egypt, which is Pharaoh and his chariots they're coming after them. And the description of that cloud, when it describes it moving from in front of them to in between the two camps, includes the terms darkness and light. And we'll look at that verse a little closer later. So on day one, we had light separated from dark, and now we have a cloud described as dark and light, separating the camp of Israel from the camp of Egypt. And we're going to come back to that cloud a little bit later. Let's look at the spiritual significance of the second one, unleavened bread. Okay, keep in mind, this spring bundle is a picture of redemption from death and resurrection. And this is happening during this period when leaven has been removed from the dwellings of those who have followed the instructions to remove it from their dwellings. From the home, that would be your physical picture of removing leaven, and from the heart, and there's your spiritual picture of removing leaven from the dwelling. Now, you might say, well, the Feast of Unleavened Bread didn't start till the day after Passover. Do you remember they're supposed to eat the Passover lamb with unleavened bread? And the first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath. So you've got to have the leaven out of the house going into Passover. So during this whole 8 days, you're not going to... Now, I'm not sure if you can have it on the last day, because then there's the 6 days and then 7 days. So one of those issues, huh? Yeah, I know. Once you start trying to do this and you look at the instructions, there's all these, well, now it could mean this or it could mean that. It's real interesting. And that's why I didn't want to get into the timing too much, because we could get bogged down in that. That is a soggy bog right there. Okay, so these are happening during a time when leaven has been removed. So I want to talk about leaven, about what that is. And I have learned something during the study about what that is. I think I have. The traditional view is that leaven is sin or pride or hypocrisy. And that's how I have always talked about it. It's removing the sin from your house, removing the sin from your heart. And it's kind of, but not quite, I think, not quite accurate. And you know what not quite accurate is. It leads to, well, let's just do this. I'm going to throw this out there, and then I'm going to back it up. So just stay with me. That leaven is teaching. Leaven is actually teaching. Now, sin or pride is a natural extension of bad teaching. So you can see how we might have arrived at that leaven is sin. But see, leaven is not always a bad thing. It's supposed to be removed here, but then on the Shavuot, the one in the center, you offer up leavened loaves of bread. And then there's a parable where leaven is good. So if leaven were sin, sin is never good. But leaven is. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. And so that's what I found curious, and I kind of went into that. Let's look at what Yeshua says about leaven. Jesus said to them in Matthew 16, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And then the disciples start talking about, did somebody bring bread? And he says, "How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you about bread? But beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Then they understood that he did not say, "Beware of the leaven of bread," but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Right there. Now, he does bring this up again. In Luke chapter 12, he says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees," which is hypocrisy. So you say, oh, well, okay. So leaven could be hypocrisy because he just said it was right there. Hold on a second. Put teaching in there where it says leaven and try that. Beware of the teaching of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Was their teaching hypocrisy? Were they saying one thing, doing another? That difference between what was inward and what was outward. Yeah. So their teaching was hypocrisy. Now Matthew 13 might make more sense. This is the parable where leaven is good. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till all was leavened." Now, if leaven is sin, we would say, the kingdom of heaven is like sin that a woman took and hid in until all was... No, that can't work. So what if leaven is teaching? The kingdom of heaven is like teaching, Torah, the word, which a woman, Israel, took and hid in 3 measures of flour until all was leavened, until it has filled the whole thing. The teaching has... Hold on, the teaching has filled the whole thing. In Habakkuk, he says, "The earth will be filled with" what? "With the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So the kingdom of heaven is like teaching, the word, Yeshua. It's like that stone cut without hands that does what? Becomes a great mountain and fills the entire earth.
Well, my question is, why do we get rid of it then?
That is what I'm...
You're a genius.
Nice segue. Yes, that's exactly what we're going to talk about now. Let's just keep rolling, and then we'll pause at the end of this leaven section because I know that there might be some things that you want to input here online, and I can't see you right now. So that is a good question. Why, if leaven is teaching, why are we separating teaching from the dwelling during the spring feast, those first 3, and then offering leavened bread at the 4th one, at Shavuot? That almost seems weirder now. Why do we separate teaching during the spring and then bring the teaching back in at Shavuot? I think it may have to do with where the Israelites were when they were told to remove the leaven. They were in Egypt. And I want to, this is my object lesson. I'm not going to destroy another plant.
Not destroy it.
I won't destroy it. I might pull a little bit out though.
Oh no.
Is that not good?
What's soupy?
Yeah, I know. I know. Okay, this is my son's sourdough starter. Okay.
No,
It's still going. It just needed to, okay, sourdough starter. So I don't know if you've ever made one of these, but what you do is you put flour with water and then it absorbs the yeast from the air. Flour absorbs yeast from the air to become leaven. So he's going to put flour and water together and just wait. And then this is going to become this yeast monster, is what I call it. So, and what you do is you take, how much of this do you put?
Not much.
Not much. A little leavens the whole lump. When he's making bread, he'll put his flour and his water, and then this is what he puts in there to leaven the whole thing he's got in the mixing bowl over there. Just a little bit of that.
No. Taste it.
Yeah, it smells breadish. No. Okay, so I want you to think of these Israelites in Egypt, because they would have had their sourdough starter like this that they would have used to make their bread. And some people, I think there are batches of this that are hundreds of years old.
Yeah. Wow.
That they've kept for, yeah, there's some famous sourdough bread bakeries that use really, really old, sourdough starter. Yeah. Yeah, I let him do that because it grosses me out just a little bit. But the bread is great. Okay, so think about the Israelites in Egypt. They would have had their sourdough starter that had absorbed leaven from the Egyptian air. And air is spirit, and Egypt is the world. So that if leaven is teaching, their sourdough starter, so to speak, would have been laced with the spirit of the world. Okay? He tells them, get rid of the leaven when you're in Egypt. Get rid of that. You're leaving. Put your dough, take your dough unleavened and come out to the wilderness. Now, in the wilderness, they're going to begin a new batch. And that batch is going to be absorbing the leaven from the air or spirit in the wilderness. And that's where they get their teaching from the mountain. Not their teaching from the world, the doctrines of man. They're teaching from the mountain, directly from God. So now remember those frogs in Egypt? One of the places where those frogs went was into their kneading bowls, into the kneading bowls of Egypt, where they would make their bread. And frogs are I think there's a verse in there somewhere that says frogs like unclean spirits. No, unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Bad teaching is like an unclean spirit coming out of the mouth. And I'd always thought it curious that in the description of the people leaving Egypt, it says the people took their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their clothes on their shoulders. They wrapped up those kneading bowls so as they left Egypt, they wouldn't have absorbed any more of that bad leaven, the bad teaching, the doctrines of men. And I think just like some bakeries have yeast cultures or sourdough starters that are hundreds of years old, I think that Israel, we as Israel, if you think of leaven as teaching, have some cultures, some sourdough starters that are thousands of years old. And that's just what we've been told. That's what our fathers were taught by their fathers, by their fathers, by their fathers. And we just keep passing this down and keeping that leavened, that bad, the culture leavened with the doctrines of men. We keep it that alive. And what we need to do this spring is work on not just taking that physical leaven out of our house or the sin out of the heart, which is not a bad thing to do at all, but unlearning things we've learned that are from men and not from the Word. So Israel takes their unleavened dough into the wilderness, and they begin a new batch, one that absorbs teaching from the air, from the Spirit in the wilderness. And that batch would have been leavened with good teaching. They left behind the teaching of Egypt for the teaching at the mountain. They've humbled themselves so that they can be lifted up and waved before the Lord at Shavuot, like those good leavened loaves in the middle. So there's a certain amount of unlearning that needs to occur before you get to the mountain. We want to be able to, 50 days later, after removing that leaven, we want to be able to approach the mountain and receive that good word, have a place, a nice clean place to put that. I wanted to see if anyone online or in the room had a comment before we move on to the next feast. Tracy.
Just to touch on why we get the leaven out every year is the same reason why we keep any of the feasts every year. It's just to keep that remembrance, and things do sneak back in, and each year it gives us the opportunity to re-examine our lives and allow Messiah to unleaven us again from man-made doctrine and tradition. But we keep the Passover every year, even though Messiah has already been crucified, in remembrance of that. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. That was a great point. As we move to this third one, first fruits, let's review just a few things we've learned about 3. 3 is the number of resurrection. Yeshua spent 3 days and nights in the grave and then was resurrected. On day 3 of creation, the plants and the trees sprouted from the land, yielding seed and bearing fruit after their own kind. And just as a seed falls into the ground and dies, then it sprouts, it resurrects, and continues to produce more seed. That's day 6, when the beasts were created. Somebody's phone just mooed. Okay. Just this seed sprouts, it resurrects, and it continues to produce more seed, and then that more seed and more seed, and it propagates into eternity. So you got eternal life there, resurrection, eternal life. When you come across language like spring up, or rise up, or lift up, or sprout, or ascend, or wave, like wave offerings, I want you to think resurrection. Now remember, the first fruits of the barley is the first crop to ripen. And that sheaf is presented to the priest, who then waves it before the Lord. Okay? The nation does not eat of the produce of the land until that happens. Now, in 1 Corinthians, it says, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the resurrection language, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And then it says, but each in his own turn, Christ the first fruits, then at his coming, those who belong to him. So there's order here. You do the first fruits first. That's waved before the Lord for his acceptance, and then the nation partakes. Okay? Now remember when Mary came to the tomb on the day of first fruits, and he said, do not cling to me. I have not yet ascended to the Father. He's that first fruit sheaf that hasn't been waved before the Father yet. Later in the day, that will have happened, and you'll find the disciples and him now touching is not a problem. And now they can partake of him. This third one, the first fruits, is chiastically connected to the 5th one. They're both resurrection days. It will be at the sound of the trumpet that the dead will be raised imperishable and caught up in the cloud, much like the Israelites were under the cloud when they left Egypt during their wilderness journey. When they left Egypt, leaven-free and in a hurry. Okay, so we've come back to in a hurry. And I want to pick that up now, in haste. Remember that the menorah was designed after an almond tree. It had almond branches. And the watchful tree, the first one to wake up in the spring. We previously discussed the word for almond and watching, that shaked and shakad, and the connection there to the eyes and the seven spirits. In Jeremiah chapter 1, it says, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" And he says, "I see the rod of an almond tree." And then the Lord says to him, "Thou hast seen well, for I will hasten my word to perform it." Hasten, in a haste, in a hurry. I want to call your attention to this verse from Matthew 24. If those days had not been cut short, nobody would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. All right. Okay. I want you to fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to present an idea of Halissa's on this concept of haste or hurry or time being cut short, like a quickening of time. Yes, there might actually be a Kwitzak Haderach. I'm just kidding. You can keep this in your pocket if you want to see if further study bears it out. When I first heard this, I was baffled. And she kept bringing it up. She kept bringing it up. And then I looked at it more closely, and I began to see how the separation of the themes, well, if you look at that side of our template, there's this emphasis on separation. You have the separation of light and dark, the upper and lower waters, and then the waters and the land. You had the separation during Passover between Egypt and Israel, the separation of leaven out of the house, the separation of that first sheaf, the first fruits of the barley that's to be separated and weighed before the Lord. And then on the other side of our template, you had these themes of covering, like atonement, being covered, Sukkot being covered with your temporary dwelling. As I looked into this, these themes of separation over here and covering over here, they kind of begin to fold in on each other and overlay each other, because you'll see there's some intertwining between those two there. And remember when Israel left Egypt in haste, the first place they camped was Sukkot. From Passover to Sukkot, okay? They left in haste, and they've gone straight from number 1 to number 7, so to speak. So look at your menorah, and I'm gonna switch. I want to be able to see you guys. I want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing here. This is going to be my second object lesson. Look at your menorah. We spent quite a bit of time talking about this center one. This position being the door, the dalet, the fourth one. It's the authority position. Okay, so now fold this in half. Do you see what happens if you close the door? Now, those who are redeemed and leaven-free right here at Passover, the first feast, go straight through to Sukkot, the last one, where their firstborn are redeemed. Okay, like a warp or a fold in times. And now unleavened bread right here and atonement line up. Those who have removed the leaven are covered. And the resurrection of Yeshua, here on the third one, lines up with the resurrection of his people at the sound of a trumpet. Okay, with our menorah folded like this, in terms of time, in terms of the appointed times, you now have a time, times, and half a time. Okay, and we've seen that there's a debate over whether the tribulation lasts 3.5 years or 7 years. And what if it's really a matter of perspective, depending on which side of the door you're on, depending on whether you are covered by his wings or outside where there's weeping, in the camp of Israel or in the camp of Egypt. In Revelation 12, it says the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for times, and half a time away from the presence of the serpent. Later, in Revelation, 3 chapters later, those who have overcome, those who are victorious over the beast, sing a song. They sing the song of Moses. And here is a short piece of that song. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the howling wasteland of a wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. That's also taught, that word for cared. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, he spread his wings. He caught them. He carried them on his pinions. The Lord alone guided him, and there was no foreign god with him. They are encircled. They are carried on his wings. There's no foreign god with them. It cleaned it out. He's guarded them as the apple of his eye. That apple of his eye, Ishon, that's the pupil. It's also translated as middle and time. Isaiah 40. Those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. Psalm 17. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings. Now, I keep alluding to these branches on the menorah as wings. So, is it reasonable to think of these as wings? Okay, before we look at that word for wings, I want to bring to mind some other symbols that we have seen associated with the menorah. When Zechariah sees the golden lampstand with its 7 lamps, those 7 lamps are defined as the eyes of the Lord roaming throughout the earth. In Revelation, we have a lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes, and those are defined as the 7 spirits of God sent forth out into all the earth. So we've seen that the lamp is associated with eyes. Remember the almond tree? Watchful tree? Okay, so think of this menorah as the watchful tree. Now I want you to look at the word for wings. The word for wings is kanaf, and that is translated in a bunch of different ways. I've bolded a few of these: corner, covering, edge, ends, fold, garment, skirt, wing, and wingspan. I want to look at this description of the 4 living creatures. It says they had 6 wings and were covered with eyes all around, even under its wings. I want you to think about the similarities between the seraphim, that's what the 6-winged things are called, and the menorah. The seraphim, that's the plural of seraph, and seraph means to burn. The seraphim, the burning ones, have 6 wings. They're covered in eyes, even under their wings. Okay. The menorah, the one with the 7 flames, has 6 branches coming out of the center, like wings, and it's decorated with almond blossoms, figurative for eyes. So the menorah, in a sense, is a type of burning one with 6 wings covered in eyes. I want to look at the idea of these wings closing or encircling, creating a hidden place. In Isaiah 6:2, it describes seraphim again. It says, each having 6 wings, With 2 wings, they covered their faces. With 2 wings, they covered their feet. And with 2 wings, they were flying. I think here this illustrates this idea of this folding in, or the covering and the flying. And so we're going to be pulling in the cloud and that hidden place under his wings idea. And I wanted to show you this picture that got me thinking about this. In the back of your workbook, she takes the menorah, and it's from a higher angle view, and it's also with the branches starting to be pulled in. And when I saw this was a while back. This was this is over a year ago. No, it was a long time ago that I looked at this and I thought, is that supposed to be one of those six-winged things? And so it's kind of where the idea is jumping from. Here in Psalms, he says, where he's speaking about the Lord being his fortress, his rock in whom he takes refuge, he says, he also bowed the heavens down low and came down. With thick darkness under his feet, he rode on a cherub and flew. He sped on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place, his canopy around him, darkness of waters, thick clouds. And when you hear clouds, think the cloud that protected and covered Israel as she was taken out of Egypt and led into the wilderness to be nourished by the heavenly bread, the bread filled with leaven, the teaching of the Holy One. So,
interesting that darkness is here meant as a positive thing.
yeah, that's why when we were in Genesis 1, I wanted to point out that darkness is not always a bad place. That's where he is. You know, the inside of the tabernacle. It's a really dark place, except for what? The menorah, lighting it up. And then in the Holy of Holies, the holy presence. And then you have covering of wings there too, in that dark place, because the cherubim on the ark cover it. And they're also embroidered on the veil in between. So there's a lot of this imagery of wings. It starts to pop up everywhere, especially when you go cloud wings and start to see that parallel there. And in Isaiah 31, he says, like flying birds, so the Lord of armies will protect Jerusalem. He will protect it and save it. He will pass over and rescue it. And that pass over, the same term as Passover in Egypt. In Revelation chapter 12, it starts with a woman, Israel. She's pregnant and she's crying out in labor in pain. She's giving birth. In Isaiah 26, there's also a pregnant woman crying out who's about to give birth. That's in verse 17. You move down to verse 19, and there's this resurrection language. Your dead will live, their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy. Your dew is as the dew of dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits. And then it says, come, my people, enter your rooms and close your doors. Hide for a little while. A short time? Hide for a short time until indignation runs its course. For behold, the Lord is about to come out from his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their wrongdoing. Clearly, there's some sort of separation here happening before judgment. His people are hidden and protected. At the Red Sea, you had that pillar of cloud. I still want to use this as my illustration. At the Red Sea, you had that pillar of cloud that moved between the camp of Israel and the camp of Egypt. That cloud is also referred to as something else. Right here, it says, and this is a description of that thing that was in between their camps. It says, the angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them. The pillar of cloud went from before their face and stood behind them. Same thing. Okay? And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And it was a cloud and darkness, but it gave light by night. So the one did not come near the other all night. That's a beautiful picture of the angel of God, that pillar of cloud, both darkness, hidden in secret, and light, standing between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. So if we have under his wings and under the cloud being places of refuge, so is being hidden in his tent. It's also a place of refuge. Remember, after the first Passover, the Israelites went directly to a place called Sukkot, temporary shelters, like tents. In Psalm, he says, "For on the day of trouble he will conceal me in his tabernacle. He will hide me in the secret place of his tent." Psalm 31, "You hide them in the secret place of your presence, in the conspiracies of mankind. You keep them secretly in a shelter from the strife of tongues." Psalm 91, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will lodge in the shadow of the Almighty. He will cover you with his pinions. Under his wings you may take refuge." Okay? "For he will give his angels orders concerning you to protect you in all your ways. On their hands they will lift you up so that you do not strike your foot against a stone." That's familiar, isn't it? You remember where Yeshua was when Satan quoted this to him? Yeah, he was on the pinnacle of the temple. Remember, Satan took him up to the pinnacle of the temple. Okay. That word for pinnacle is the Greek word, I'm going to butcher this, pteurgion. And that word means, the definition is a little wing. So he was on a wing, and the King James even translates it as the wing of the temple. He was on the wing of the dwelling place of the Most High, and Satan was asking him to throw himself off and make the Lord prove that he would protect him, to test that Lord's promise of refuge. Does that echo Israel in the wilderness saying, "Is he in our midst? Is he really protecting us?" And don't we do that? Where's God? Ooh. And Yeshua said, do not put his response to Satan was, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." And Yeshua passed this test in the wilderness where Israel had not. Even after they had been led out to the wilderness under a cloud and protected, they asked, "Is the Lord in our midst?" And I think it would be interesting to do a study on that phrase, "in our midst" or "in the midst," and see what's happening around it, because it pops up a lot. Psalm 32, "How blessed is he whose wrongdoing is forgiven, whose sin is covered." Think atonement. "How blessed is the person whose guilt the Lord does not take into account, and in whose spirit there is no deceit." Think the leaven removed. "Certainly in a flood of great waters they will not reach him. You are my hiding place. You keep me from trouble." This flood of great waters will not reach him. Remember, the dragon pours water after that woman, the one who's taken to the wilderness for times and half a time. That flood of great waters will not reach him. You surround me with songs of deliverance. The one who trusts in the Lord, goodness will surround him. You have encircled me behind and in front and placed your hand upon me. His left hand is under my head. His right hand embraces me. Surrounded, encircled, covered. Okay. We need to have that faith of Abraham. Or maybe we could just have the faith that we had when we were kids, when we believed that hiding under the covers would protect us from the lightning storm. If these wings have folded, closed, encircled the redeemed, then we see this covering coming into line with the barley harvest in the spring. And it would be fantastic to be redeemed at the time of the barley harvest, to be covered and protected. Let's look at we're going to wrap up soon. We're going to look at the redemption by the kinsman redeemer at the time of the barley harvest. Okay, a quick run through the book of Ruth. We're not going to read the book of Ruth. I pulled out just a few of my favorite pieces. There are so many things that link to this, but I pulled out a few of my favorites. Ruth is a Moabite who has been grafted into Israel. It uses the phrase, left her father and her mother and the land of her birth and came to a people she did not previously know. And then she says to her mother-in-law, all that you say I will do, which is what they said at the mountain. So she's crossed over like Abraham did. She's a Hebrew. And now here she comes like the bride saying, I will do. Okay, when Boaz comes back from Bethlehem, of all places, her Redeemer coming from Bethlehem, his servant tells him about Ruth, and he says, she came and has remained from morning until now. She's been sitting in the house for a little while, a short time, sitting in the house. She has not gone into another field. She stayed in the field of Boaz, her kinsman redeemer, and she stayed close by the young women of Boaz in order to glean, how long? Until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. This season right here. A shortened time. She has washed herself, anointed herself, she's put on her best clothes, and she has gone down to the threshing floor where her Redeemer is threshing barley. He's preparing the first fruits. Okay, and she's there at the appointed time. The Feast of First Fruits stays into the wheat harvest at Shavuot. It's a little wonder why this book is the book that they read at Shavuot. Okay, that's the anniversary of when they came to the mountain and said, all that you say we will hear and we will do. Okay. At mealtime, Boaz says, come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. She eats with him. She dines with him. She eats of the bread dipped in bitterness. And my favorite thing that it says in here is, this is Boaz speaking to her. May the Lord reward your work, and may your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Wings, remember it's covering, garment. When her Redeemer asked her who she was, she said, I am Ruth, your slave. Now spread your garment over your slave, for you are a Redeemer. Spread your garment, kanaf. And in the ESV version, it says, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a Redeemer. She presents herself to him there as a bondservant, his slave. She finds refuge under his garment. And he says to her, all the people in the city will know that you are a woman of excellence. The woman of excellence, the bride. Remember, she identified herself as being his slave, but we know that later she will become his wife. Hosea 2. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, bring her into the wilderness, and speak kindly to her. Then I will give her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor, trouble, as a door of hope. And she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. And it will come about in that day that you will call me Ishi, my husband, and will no longer call me Baali, my owner. So, can getting under the covers protect us from a storm? Is there refuge under the cloud, under the wings? Can keeping the appointed times and leaving Egypt leaven-free, free from the teachings of men, provide us safe passage through the waters that will snuff out the lamp of the wicked, like Pharaoh, his wicked, hardened heart, devising wicked plans, getting snuffed out in the Red Sea. I hope that this has made the idea of hiding under the shadow of his wings, under his covers, more meaningful. Questions and comments?
Evan? How do I practically do that?
Hear and obey. How did the Israelites do it?
Having faith in God? Trusting in Him?
Yeah, well, and that if you read about their time in the wilderness, you read about instances where they didn't do it. where they removed themselves from the cover of the cloud, outside the camp. Okay? You had them testing him in the wilderness. And so you have all these examples. This Exodus thing is there for us to learn for now. And so when you're thinking, how do I practically do that? You look back at what happened there. What was going on there? Because that whole thing is given to us in great detail so that hopefully we won't make those same mistakes. Although I feel like I already have made all of those same mistakes.
Well, the Israelites are somewhat still around today, and you are too.
Yeah. In exile.
There's definitely some neat metaphors going on there, and I think all of us definitely want to try to focus on being under the shelter of the Lord's wings for sure. I know that we need to. I think that being obedient, clearing out the leaven. And I was looking at that as part of my study yesterday and today, thinking about when Angela and I talked the other day, she's preparing her notes regarding, leaven being doctrine. I hadn't really realized how serious it can be when you don't have your doctrine straight. I think you look at what happened with the disciples when they, Jesus got arrested and tortured and crucified, and it says that they all abandoned him. I had always thought that meant that they just ran because they were afraid for their lives, and I'm sure that was certainly a part of it. But one of the commentaries I was reading kind of suggested that they may have actually at that moment, had a real aha moment of, you know what, this may not be the Messiah after all. That they actually lost their faith. Not just got scared and ran, but literally lost their faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And why would that be? Because they had a doctrine of what he was supposed to do, and he did not do it. They were expecting him to rise up and defeat the Romans, and they fell away from their faith when their preconceived ideas about how things were supposed to happen did not come to pass. So the doctrines of men can be very, very damaging to fill your head with ideas. And I mean, we've talked about this many times about, a pre-tribulation rapture, I think everybody looks around at the world and what's happening, and they're wondering why Jesus hasn't sucked them off the planet yet. I think that's going to be a real stumbling block.
And I thought when, Alyssa was talking about this idea, this folding of time or something, I thought that is weird. And I was like, okay, but it's not much weirder than getting sucked out of your clothes and into the atmosphere. So let me see what it says about that.
I think, many of us who have looked at the, rapture do still believe in the rapture. It's just that the timing is a little off. But if you were expecting it to be one thing and it didn't turn out to be that way, you could be having a faith crisis. Tracy?
Just to kind of comment on what Andrew just said about folding of time, I pondered this before too, is where we're told to repent, which means to return.
Mm-hmm.
When the sign that middle spot in the Nora, it's like a mirror, right? Chiasm, it's like a mirror. So he's essentially taking us back, because he's taking us back to the garden. So it's really this idea of he's coming, we're looking in this mirror, and he's taking us back. It's hard to explain, but it's like a folding of time where it's like we're not going this way, we're going back, to the beginning, to where it all started, how it was supposed to be.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. It is a weird idea. When she first told me about that, some of these concepts she was talking about, I was like, yeah, that's pretty wild.
I love what she says, by the way, because also when we go back, we need freedom, which we basically also, we needed, unfortunately, the devil. Because through the devil we can learn, and we learn through freedom and to choose God and need to go back. So we don't like what she said.
And even with freedom, there's two different teachings there. Is it freedom from sin, or is it this other idea of freedom where I can do whatever I want? Which is what we think it means freedom. Freedom, a lack of freedom is when we're restricted from doing what we want. But really freedom is the freedom from sin. And death.
Yeah, excellent.
And immortality, again, also in the beginning, the first day, back to immortality.
No, that's fantastic. Any other comments? No, I think we all need to be encouraged by that. I think, you know, I guess my takeaway from this would be repent, clear out the leaven all the time. Don't wait for Passover.
Yeah.
You don't want to be waiting for Passover, because that's not a great idea.
Yeah, I was sitting there saying that, but don't think that I mean, I just found some leaven this week. And I know there's more there, because it's everywhere. It's invasive. It's in the air. Or not, according to Hayden.
It's in the flour, it's in everything you eat, everything you consume.
Yes.
Everything you consume.
And I read that it was a fungus, and that just freaked me out.
Well,
Mushrooms are also fun.
Yeah, I don't like those either.
well, that's awesome. I thank you, Angela.